The sun blazed down on the quiet suburban street as Lisa Williams stepped out of her car, holding her young son, Elijah, by the hand. She had just picked him up from school, and they were heading home for the afternoon. But before they could take another step, flashing red and blue lights flooded the pavement. A police cruiser screeched to a stop, and an officer stepped out, his eyes locked onto Lisa and her son. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you," the officer said, his voice cold and firm. Lisa's stomach tightened. Something about the way he looked at them sent a chill down her spine. She held Elijah closer. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. The man took a step forward, his hand resting near his holster. "We got a report about a child matching this boy's description. I need to take him in for questioning." Lisa's heart pounded. "What? He's my son." The officer's face hardened. "That remains to be seen." Panic surged through her. She reached for her phone, but before she could dial, the officer grabbed Elijah's wrist. The little boy yelped, fear flashing in his wide eyes. "Let go of him," Lisa shouted, her voice shaking. Then, just as the officer tightened his grip, another car rolled up the street. The door flew open. A man stepped out, tall, commanding, his badge glinting under the sun. Lisa gasped with relief. Her husband had arrived. And he wasn't just any man, he was an FBI agent. Lisa's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she clutched Elijah's shoulder, pulling him close. The officer still had his grip on the boy's wrist, but his eyes flickered with hesitation as the man from the car strode toward them. David Williams, Lisa's husband, wasn't just any FBI agent. He was a seasoned investigator who had spent years taking down criminals who thought they were untouchable. His sharp eyes immediately assessed the situation, landing on the officer's hand gripping his son. "Step away from my child." David's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority behind it. The officer straightened, his grip loosening just slightly. "Sir, this is official business. We received a tip about a missing child." David cut him off, his face darkening. "And instead of verifying any facts, you decided to lay hands on my son, without probable cause." Lisa saw the moment the officer's confidence wavered. He hadn't expected pushback, especially not from someone who clearly knew the law inside and out. "I'm just doing my job," the officer muttered, his jaw tightening. David pulled out his badge and held it up. "And I'm doing mine. Now, I suggest you explain exactly where this tip came from and why you thought it was enough to justify grabbing a child in broad daylight." The street was silent except for the distant hum of traffic. The officer's eyes darted around, as if looking for backup. But now he was the one who looked trapped. The officer's fingers twitched near his belt, but he hesitated. David hadn't raised his voice, but the weight behind his words made it clear. This wasn't going to end the way the officer had planned. Lisa could feel Elijah trembling against her, his small hand clutching her dress. "I received an anonymous tip," the officer finally said, shifting uncomfortably. "A boy matching this child's description was reported missing." David's jaw tightened. "And you didn't think to verify the claim before acting?" His voice was still measured, but Lisa could hear the restrained anger beneath it. "Did you ask for identification? Did you check any records? Or did you just see a black child with his mother and assume the worst?" The officer's face flushed. "That's not what this is," he insisted, but his eyes darted to the badge in David's hand. Lisa stepped forward, her voice shaking but strong. "Then what is it? Because I have my son's birth certificate, school records, and everything else in my purse." "But you didn't ask for any of that, did you?" A tense silence stretched between them. The officer glanced around again, as if searching for a way out. A few neighbors had come outside, watching the scene unfold. David took another step closer. "Who made this call?" he demanded. "Give me the report number. I'll pull the records myself." The officer hesitated, shifting on his feet, and that's when Lisa saw it, the flicker of something else in his eyes. Fear. But not of David, of something or someone else. Lissa's pulse pounded as she watched the officer shift uncomfortably under David's gaze. His hand twitched at his radio, but he didn't call anything in. The hesitation was clear. He was stuck between whatever he had planned and the reality of the situation spiraling out of his control. David took another step forward, his voice steady but unyielding. "I asked you a question. Who made the call?" The officer's eyes flickered with something unreadable. I don't have that information right now," he stammered. Lisa's breath caught. He was lying. David didn't move, didn't blink. Then get it. A muscle in the officer's jaw clenched. His gaze darted toward the watching neighbors, then back to David. He had expected an easy encounter, a scared mother, maybe even a child taken without a fight. Instead, he was facing an FBI agent who wasn't backing down. Then suddenly, the radio on the officer's belt crackled. A voice came through, low but urgent. "Unit 4, status update. Do you require assistance?" The officer hesitated, too long. David reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. "I'll call the precinct myself. Let's see if they have record of this so-called missing child report." Lisa saw the moment panic flickered across the officer's face. "That won't be necessary," he said quickly, taking a small step back. David's eyes narrowed. "Why not?" For a long second, no one moved, and then from the distance, the low hum of another car approaching broke the silence. Fast, too fast. Lisa turned just as a black SUV came tearing round the corner, and in that moment she knew this wasn't just a mistake, it was something far worse. The black SUV sped toward them, its engine roaring like a warning. Lisa's grip on Elijah tightened as her heart pounded. David tensed, stepping slightly in front of them, his instincts razor-sharp. The officer's face had drained of color, and for the first time, Lisa realized he wasn't in control of this situation either. The SUV skidded to a stop just feet away, and the back door flew open. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his expression unreadable. He wasn't wearing a badge, but something about him screamed authority. Not the kind that protected people, the kind that made problems disappear. David's entire posture shifted. "Lisa, get Elijah behind me," he said quietly. She didn't argue. The suited man's gaze flickered to the officer, then to David. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said smoothly, like he was already trying to clean up whatever mess had just unfolded. David didn't buy it. "Who are you?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Just someone making sure the right people stay in their place. His eyes landed on Lisa and Elijah, and the unspoken message sent a chill through her. David's jaw clenched. "You targeted my family. Why?" The officer shifted nervously, but the suited man barely acknowledged him. "That's not important." He nodded toward Elijah. "What is important is that you hand over the boy and walk away." Lisa gasped. The SUV, the fake report, it wasn't a mistake. Someone wanted Elijah, and they had planned every second of this. David's entire body went rigid. The moment the suited man mentioned handing over Elijah, something inside him snapped. There was no more doubt. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. This was something deeper, something planned. And whoever these men were, they had underestimated the wrong family. Lisa's breath came in quick gasps, but she refused to let fear take over. Elijah clung to her, his small fingers digging into her arm, sensing the danger. David stepped forward, planting himself between them and the man by the SUV. "You think I'm just going to hand over my son?" His voice was deadly calm. The suited man's smirk faltered. "You don't have a choice." David's fingers twitched, but he didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't need to. He was already 3 steps ahead. "That's where you're wrong." Before the man could react, David spoke into his phone, which had been recording the entire conversation. "I want all units at my location. Now." The officer beside them flinched, his gaze darting between the suited man and David. He looked like he had just realized he was on the wrong side of something much bigger than him. Then the sound of sirens cut through the air. Not just 1 or 2, dozens. The suited man's face darkened. "You have no idea what you've just done." David held his ground. "Oh, I do. And so do they." He nodded toward the end of the street, where flashing lights appeared in the distance. Lisa felt a wave of relief crash over her, but then she saw it, the suited man slipping his hand into his pocket. Not for a weapon, but for a phone. He wasn't done yet, and whatever was coming next, David knew they had only seconds to stop it. David's eyes locked onto the suited man's hand as he lifted his phone. Whatever he was about to do, it wouldn't be good. Without hesitation, David lunged, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it back. The phone clattered to the pavement just as the first wave of police cars screeched to a stop. Officers poured out, guns drawn, surrounding the scene. The suited man barely reacted, his face eerily calm. "You think this ends here," he muttered. "You have no idea who you're up against." David didn't flinch, neither do you. Lisa held Elijah close as uniformed officers swarmed the area. The corrupt officer who had started it all raised his hands in surrender, realizing there was no way out. As two officers led him away, David turned to the commanding officer on the scene. "Run a trace on that phone," he ordered, "and find out exactly who these men work for." The suited man was silent as he was placed in handcuffs. But before he was led to a squad car, he turned back to David, a knowing smirk playing at his lips. "This isn't over." David met his gaze, unwavering. "No, it's not. But you just lost." As the sirens faded and the chaos settled, Lisa finally let out the breath she had been holding. She knelt down, cupping Elijah's face. "Are you okay, baby?" Elijah nodded, his eyes wide but trusting. "Daddy saved us." David placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Always."